Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. In Administrator Schwab's position statement, he says that the NMFSS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services are to list species and to determine to be endangered or threatened, and to subsequently protect those species and their habitats. And that's a mandate for both of your departments. Now, in that light, when I reviewed Director Ashe's statement, Director Ashe, you talk about habitat conservation plans under the ESA, and then you also mention ESA conservation action plans with the Bureau of Land Management and various other parts of the department. I'm just curious as to whether these are specific terms of arts and they refer to different kinds of conservation plans.
Excuse me. A habitat conservation plan is a statutory term of art. So in Section 10 of the law, where we are authorized to issue permits for incidental take associated with otherwise lawful activity. So if you were a private party and were undertaking an activity that was otherwise lawful and would take endangered species, we can authorize you to do that. But if you develop a habitat conservation plan to minimize the effects of that take. And a candidate conservation agreement is an administratively created instrument that allows us to work with a federal agency or another party to promote conservation of a candidate species before it gets on the list. So it's a way that we try to get ahead of the curve and try to deal with species conservation issues early.
So when we hear the words an endangered habitat area, is that different from the habitat conservation plan? When there's a designated endangered habitat, in other words.
Critical habitat.
Critical habitat, right.
Critical habitat is another function of the law. When we list a species, the law asks us to identify the critical habitat for that species. And generally, the law commands us to do that. There are some cases in which we can decline if we determine it's not prudent to determine critical habitat, but in general the law asks us to define critical habitat. Critical habitat is not a protected area. It doesn't set up a refuge or a reserve of any kind. It simply is an indication of what are the physical attributes of habitat that are important for the survival and recovery of the species. And there are restrictions against federal agencies for adversely modifying or destroying critical habitat. So it doesn't apply to private landowners unless they are applying to the federal government for some form of assistance or authorization. So
in Administrator Schwab's statement, he talks about the ESA in 16 U.S.C. 1531 to 1543 that requires the list and then their habitat. So that's what you're talking about now. The endangered habitat. So back to, the critical habitat. So now we have critical habitats, which do not really, are just the designation. And then we have habitat conservation plans. And there's this ESA conservation action plans that you also referenced. So out of all of those, which is the most restricted or restrictive plan that one could be subjected to?
I don't think it's, they're all actually, habitat conservation plan is a permissive plan. So when you develop a habitat conservation plan, it allows you to take, to do something that's otherwise unlawful, to take an endangered species. So it's not a restrictive plan, it's a permissive plan. A critical habitat is not a plan at all. It's simply a factual identification of habitat that is critical to the survival and recovery of the species. So it's not a plan, it's an identification. A candidate conservation agreement, I would say again, is not a plan, it's an agreement between two parties, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Bureau of Land Management, or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a private landowner. And so those are voluntary agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, my time's up, but could I request that they sort of give us a chart that I can easily follow?
Absolutely. I think that would be very, very helpful, and I'd ask you to provide that again for the full committee, and we'll certainly see that you all get that. That's a good suggestion.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Schwab, I'm sorry I wasn't here for your testimony, but I understand you're one of those folks who believes that fish hatcheries are a really bad idea because of the effect on natural selection. Would you elaborate on that?